I'm Doug Mooter. I've been a member of this church since sometime in the 90s, and not that many people know this because not many people were there, but back in the 90s, I led one of the most poorly attended church services ever. Um, it was in the middle of winter and the heat was out, so we had like 30, 35 people, something like that. So I guess I'll just get started. Several years ago, two of my best friends retired to a part of Florida that was a bit of a drive from the nearest Unitarian Universalist church. Eventually, they realized that a lot of other people were making that same drive, so they got those people together and started a fellowship. Really? Can't? Wow, okay. So, I had friends in Florida who started the fellowship. And that was a fascinating process for me, both to watch both from a distance and in person when I visited, because a new fellowship is on the opposite end of the spectrum from a centuries-old church like this one. Unlike us, they did hardly anything out of habit or tradition because they had to invent their traditions week by week and put a lot of effort into making them real. And so they never lost sight of big questions that we sometimes overlook. Like, why are we doing this? Not just why are we talking about this particular topic or singing this particular hymn, but why are we a congregation? What are we trying to accomplish by being a church? Now, the church I grew up in had a good answer to that question. We were conservative Lutherans in the small Midwestern town of Quincy, Illinois. And we needed to belong to a church and go there on Sundays because God had commanded, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I had Catholic neighbors, and their reason was even better. Their place in heaven depended on rituals that could only be performed by the church. Some sects teach that eternal life comes from believing the right dogmas. And how are you supposed to know what those are unless some authority stands in a pulpit and tells you? Some people think that joining a church is how you pick a side in the cosmic battle between good and evil. Those are clear, powerful reasons, but I don't think any of them will work for us. Heaven, for example, is not what Unitarian Universalism is really about. The Unitarian side of our tradition focuses on this world, and Universalists teach that everyone is going to heaven, so coming here doesn't give you any special advantage. As for dogmas, we don't have a lot of them. If you're looking for a creed, the UU principles are a pretty poor substitute. Rather than factual declarations of our unique doctrines, they're statements about our values and our vision for the world we want to make and to live in. We believe in the worth of all people, in justice and compassion, in democracy and the search for truth. In other words, things that any good person might believe, whatever religion they belong to. Somerset Maugham made fun of that lack of dogma in his novel of Human Bondage, where one of the characters says, "A Unitarian very earnestly disbelieves in almost everything anybody else believes, and he has a lively, sustaining faith in he doesn't quite know what." So if it's not going to pave our way to heaven or explain the nature of the cosmos, what does a UU church do for us? For a long time, the chief selling point of Unitarian Universalism is what it doesn't do. It doesn't make you feel guilty for asking questions or having doubts. It doesn't tell you to ignore science or insist that you practice the prejudices that come down from the Bronze Age. It doesn't make you recite a creed you don't really believe. That's sort of a less is more attitude, and it's summed up by a story that is told about Fannie Holmes, the wife of the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Supposedly, Fannie was talking to one of Oliver's clerks, who knew that the old man wasn't particularly religious and so was surprised to hear that Fannie and Oliver were Unitarians. Well, she explained, we're from Boston. In Boston, you have to be something, and Unitarian is as near nothing as you can get. That argument made sense 100 years ago, but it really doesn't anymore, because today you don't have to be something. If you're looking for a religion that's near nothing, you can pick nothing. A lot of people do, and more all the time. The Pew Research Center says that about 29% of Americans consider themselves religiously unaffiliated, up sharply from 16% in 2007. And even the people who identify with a religion don't necessarily belong to a congregation. In rough numbers, the 1,000 congregations of the UUA have about 200,000 members. But pollsters who ask people about their religions estimate that about 600,000 people claim to be Unitarian Universalists. Nobody's sure who exactly those other 400,000 UUs are. Maybe they used to belong to a church, but they've since moved and they didn't find a new one. Or maybe they heard about Unitarian Universalism somewhere and agree with it philosophically, but they're just not joiners. Like Kurt Vonnegut, for example. When he gave the Ware Lecture at General Assembly in 1984, Vonnegut said, "In order not to seem a spiritual quadriplegic to strangers trying to get a fix on me, I sometimes say I'm a Unitarian Universalist." Maybe he would have told a pollster that, but I never found a congregation that claimed him as a member. Maybe he just wasn't a joiner. Many people aren't, and why should they be? After all, there are a lot of ways that you could spend your Sunday mornings. You could sleep in or catch up on current events by reading a newspaper or watching TV. You could pick up some interesting new ideas by watching a TED Talk on YouTube. You could even watch a church service on YouTube. We post ours, and so do a lot of other churches. So you could find the best church in the country and watch their service on a laptop without getting out of bed. You could fast forward through the boring parts and pause whenever you needed a break and not have to deal with anybody. It could just be you and the screen. And that option points to one fairly obvious reason why you might come to First Parish or why you might decide to join. Because maybe too much of your life already is you and the screen. Maybe interacting with people face to face isn't a cost of coming to church, it's a benefit. And maybe you join because you want to see some of the same people over and over again, to recognize them and be recognized by them. There are a whole bunch of reasons you might want that, but the catch-all term for them is community, a word you've heard several times already today. People come to First Parish looking for community. Sometimes community is nothing more complicated than just looking for friends. And that motive may sound a little lightweight compared to saving your immortal soul or choosing a side in the cosmic battle between good and evil. But personally, I'm not in a position to be judgmental about it, because most of my long-term friends are people I've met at UU churches. Like those friends in Florida, John and Kathy. Deb and I met them at First Parish Lexington 30-some years ago. They were deciding to have children at about the same time that we were deciding not to. And so their children more or less became our children too. We were Josh's godparents, and we accompanied the three of them to China when they adopted Josh's sister Tori. We saw all the kids' birthday parties and Halloween costumes, and stayed over every Christmas Eve so we wouldn't miss that mad early morning assault on the presents. And we're still doing that, but with adult children in Florida, who, by the way, are now the last people to get out of bed on Christmas morning. Not all my UU friendships are that close, but a few are, and if those relationships were all I'd ever gotten out of joining a church, I think that might be enough. Because meeting someone through a church community is different than, say, meeting them at work. You don't just meet them, you also have a chance to meet their spouses, their friends, their children, and maybe even their parents. Joining a church community means plugging into a network of connections, not just getting to know individuals. I used that feature intentionally once. About 20 years ago, I was visiting my Midwestern hometown when I thought about how old my parents were getting and how, like me, most of my high school friends had moved away. Quincy isn't on the way to anywhere. You would never just happen to be there. And so I foresaw that after my parents died, I would never have a reason to go back. That thought made me sad, because it felt like a large chunk of my history was going to vanish without a trace, unless I did something. Unless I made some new Quincy connections that would keep pulling me back even after my parents were gone. So I decided I needed my own Quincy community. For a lot of reasons, my parents' Lutheran church wasn't an option, but there was a small Unitarian church that some Emersonians had founded back in the 1840s. So I started attending that church whenever I was in town and going to their social events. Small churches are always looking for speakers, so I arranged to talk there if their calendar had an opening. And wouldn't you know, it worked. As my parents declined, I had to visit more and more often and stay for longer stretches. 10 years ago, when my father died and I had to clean out the house and settle the estate, I was in town for a couple of months. And that community took care of me as if I had never moved away. And now, years down the line, the future I dreaded has not come to pass. My parents are gone, but I still have a relationship with my hometown. I have people there I care about and reasons to go back. They'll be seeing me again in just a few weeks. So if your purpose in coming here is nothing deeper or more complicated than just that you need more people in your life, I get that. But at the same time, I think the reason it works is that a Unitarian Universalist congregation is more than just a place where a lot of nice people hang out. It's a community of shared values. I think John and Kathy welcomed us into their children's lives, not just because they liked us, but because they knew we were also committed to the values they were trying to teach Josh and Tori. When I reached out to the Quincy Unitarians, in part they responded because they're generous, hospitable folks. But I also think they recognized, even as we were just meeting each other, that we shared something deep. It's no small thing to carry in your imagination the vision of a world where the UU principles can be taken for granted. Where, of course, all people have worth and dignity. Of course, we seek worldwide peace and justice. And of course, we nurture the interdependent web. As a description of how the world is, it's kind of naive. But as a vision of what could be, of what we could work towards and make happen, it's powerful. Something else happens when you take seriously the distance between the world we live in and the world we want. If you think of yourself as just one person alone, it can be overwhelming. Justice, democracy, the search for truth, a sustainable future. What can I, by myself, do to bring any of that into reality? If the Unitarian Universalist vision is going to be anything more than a pleasant daydream, we need allies. We need each other. That came home to me when I was home in Quincy not quite 6 years ago. I had signed up months in advance to lead the service on the second Sunday in November, which turned out to be just a few days after the election of Donald Trump. Maybe you remember that campaign. Unlike any previous campaign, I had experienced it as an all-out assault on my UU values. Day after day, we were told that climate change is a hoax, that women lie about sexual assault, and that racism in America has been over for decades. Rather than encouraging Americans to appreciate each other, that campaign told us to fear and resent anyone different from us. If we're native-born, we should fear immigrants. If we're in an opposite-sex marriage, we should resent the same-sex couples who are claiming the same rights we have. Christians and Jews should fear Muslims. Men should be anxious about the possibility of a woman in power. If we're white, we should fear blacks, and we should actually be grateful that police are so quick to get violent with them. For months, I had stayed calm by telling myself America wasn't really like that. These kinds of arguments came from a fringe group, a tiny minority. And then they won. Suddenly I had to question everything I had believed about my country and my fellow citizens. Maybe you did too. And if that's how we felt up here in New England, picture yourself in the corn country of the Midwest. Adams County voted 3-1 for Trump, and the discrepancy in yard signs and bumper stickers was even larger. In Bedford, we speculated abstractly about the anger of working-class whites in the heartland. In Quincy, UUs looked at their neighbors and wondered, how can these be the same people I've been living next to all these years? If we felt challenged, they felt besieged. Was it even still safe for them to have their own yard signs and bumper stickers? Was it safe to talk openly in public places where people you don't know might overhear and respond? So when the congregation gathered that Sunday, they weren't just looking for an interesting talk and a nice chat afterwards. They needed to be together. They needed to look into each other's eyes and see some hope and some courage. In the hymnal, there's a responsive reading that is based on the UU principles. Some Sundays that reading might just be a pro forma thing, a transition that gets you from one part of a service to the other. But in Quincy, Illinois, on the second Sunday in November 2016, it wasn't. That morning it meant something to hear ourselves and to hear each other proclaim out loud what Unitarian Universalists stand for. In that time and place, it felt like a radical act. It felt like the beginning of resistance. And that, I believe, is also why we join. Because if I am alone, it's easy to become intimidated. It's easy to start thinking about UU values as just some funny ideas I have that maybe I shouldn't talk about too loudly. If I'm alone, it's easy to fall into despair, to think, I used to have these visions of a better world, but it didn't happen. What was I thinking? I used to try to change things, but wasn't that silly? I'm just one person. Why did I think that my thoughts, my beliefs, my values could or should matter to anybody? So yeah, it's great to have friends. It's good to have a pleasant place to go on a Sunday morning. It's nice if somebody will raise a few interesting ideas and brew some coffee to discuss them over. But there's a deeper reason to be a congregation. We come together to hold each other up through difficult times. On days when you are feeling intimidated, you can be with people who have courage. When you feel yourself slipping into despair, you can look into the eyes of people who have hope. Maybe today I do that for you. Maybe tomorrow you do that for me. We join together because we're stronger that way. We join together because we need each other.